These are 5 of the most disturbing and haunting plane crash deaths ever recorded. Tragedies marked not just by impact, but by the terrifying final moments passengers endured. Mechanical failures, cockpit chaos, or enduring mysteries, these disasters reveal the harrowing truth behind the world's most unforgettable aviation catastrophes. On August 14, 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 departed from Larnaca, Cyprus, en route to Prague with a scheduled stop in Athens. But what was supposed to be a routine journey soon became one of the most haunting tragedies in modern aviation. Within minutes of takeoff, a sequence of overlooked errors would transform the aircraft into a silent, frozen tomb. Shortly after departure, a decompression occurred in the aircraft's cabin. Unbeknownst to the crew, the pressurization system had been set to manual during a ground test and was not reset to auto before takeoff. As the plane climbed, cabin pressure failed to regulate properly. By 16,000 feet, the captain had noticed warning horns and contacted Helios's operations center to report cooling issues. Over the next several minutes, communications between the captain and the ground team showed rising confusion. Despite a suggestion from the chief engineer to check the pressurization system, the situation was misunderstood. At 28,900 feet, contact with the flight ceased. Hypoxia, a deadly lack of oxygen, had already set in. Inside the aircraft, passengers and crew gradually lost consciousness. At 34,000 feet, with temperatures outside plummeting to minus 50 degrees Celsius, oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. It remains unclear how many passengers managed to put them on. In the cockpit, both pilots were incapacitated, with the co-pilot slumped over and the captain's seat vacant. The aircraft, now on autopilot, continued flying without any human control. Greek air traffic control lost contact with the aircraft as it neared Athens. At 11:05 a.m., the Hellenic Air Force scrambled 2 F-16 fighter jets. When they intercepted the Boeing 737 at 11:24, the sight was chilling. The fighter pilots observed a motionless co-pilot and hanging oxygen masks in the cabin. Then at 11:49, they witnessed a man, flight attendant Andreas Prodromou, enter the cockpit and sit in the captain's seat. Andreas had remained conscious by using a portable oxygen tank. With some flight training, he was now the only hope for 121 souls. Andreas attempted to control the aircraft. Despite his limited experience, Andreas disengaged autopilot and began to descend the plane. He waved briefly at the F-16S, but just moments later the left engine flamed out from fuel exhaustion. The aircraft exited its holding pattern and began a rapid descent. 10 minutes later, the right engine also failed. With fuel gone and oxygen dwindling, Andreas lost consciousness. At 12:03 p.m., the aircraft slammed into a hillside near Grammatiko, 25 miles north of Athens, in a fiery explosion. All 121 people aboard, 115 passengers, of whom 22 were children and 6 crew, were killed. Forensic teams later confirmed many were still alive, though in a deep coma, at the time of impact. Most bodies were found strapped in their seats, frozen solid from the high-altitude cold. Among the lives lost was the Shurupa family. Demos, originally from Adelaide, had returned to Cyprus in 1993. He, his wife Margarita, and their daughters Sophia, 10, and Ioana, 9, were all on board. Their youngest son, George, just 2 years old, had stayed behind with relatives and was left orphaned by the tragedy. Their loss became one of the most personal and heartbreaking symbols of the disaster. The crash site was described as an aerial graveyard. The world media dubbed the incident a ghost plane. Investigators quickly identified the root cause: human error. A faulty door seal reported earlier had prompted a pressurization test on the ground, during which the system was set to manual. That setting was never changed. The pilots failed to verify the pressurization controls and later misinterpreted critical warnings as air conditioning faults rather than loss of pressure. An official inquiry placed blame primarily on the pilots, though further legal proceedings followed. In 2013, Helios director Dimitris Pantazis, flight operations director Andreas Kikidis, and chief pilot Yanko Stoimanov were convicted in an Athens court of manslaughter through conscious negligence. Chief engineer Alan Irwin, who had participated in the phone call with the captain, was acquitted, though the aircraft crashed far from populated areas. A likely result of Andreas's final heroic efforts, the emotional wreckage extended across nations. In the silent final minutes of the flight, one young man's courage stood against impossible odds, his final action sparing lives on the ground. But the 121 aboard never came home. The night of March 7, 2014, Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 departed Kuala Lumpur, heading toward Beijing with 239 souls on board. The flight was uneventful for its first hour, but within minutes of passing from Malaysian to Vietnamese airspace, the aircraft vanished from radar. The mystery that followed would become one of the chilliest in aviation history, one that still haunts us today. Flight MH370's final known transmission came at 1:19 a.m. Malaysian time, as Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah calmly signed off with, "Good night, Malaysian 370. What followed was a chilling series of events. Just minutes later, the Boeing 777-200ER stopped transmitting to air traffic control, even though Malaysian military radar continued tracking it. The aircraft veered sharply off course, crossing back over the Malay Peninsula and into the Andaman Sea. Investigators would later learn this deviation was almost certainly manual, not the result of mechanical failure. Although no one knows what happened on that flight, this is one of the most plausible theories. Captain Zahari, a seasoned pilot with over 18,000 flight hours and decades of experience, was believed to be alone in the cockpit. His co-pilot, 26-year-old Fariq Abdul Hamid, may have been lured out of the cockpit under some pretense, locking him out permanently. Zahari possibly carried out a plan that he had simulated at home on a personal flight simulator, a long, lonely flight into the remote Indian Ocean. Investigators believe Zahari deliberately climbed to 40,000 feet, where he depressurized the cabin. At that altitude, oxygen masks would have deployed, but only provided about 15 minutes of support, insufficient for survival. The result would have been swift incapacitation for the passengers and cabin crew, including the 19 Chinese calligraphy artists returning from an exhibition, the 20 employees of Freescale Semiconductor, and the dozens of Malaysian, Chinese, and other international travelers aboard. The aircraft continued on autopilot, following a path eerily similar to the one Zahari had simulated at home, eventually disappearing over the southern Indian Ocean. For nearly 7 hours after the last verbal transmission, MH370 continued to communicate with Inmarsat satellites through automated handshakes. The aircraft's satellite data unit had temporarily lost power, which investigators suggest was manually interrupted, before rebooting and re-establishing connection. These final pings were all investigators had to estimate its location. Despite the most expensive search in aviation history, spanning over 120,000 square kilometers of ocean and involving Australia, Malaysia, and China, the aircraft has never been found. The aftermath was devastating. All 227 passengers and 12 crew members were presumed dead. Families were plunged into prolonged grief. Investigations by international authorities eventually narrowed down the likeliest cause to deliberate action from the cockpit. In 2016, an FBI analysis revealed that Zahari's home flight simulator contained a rehearsal of a nearly identical route to what MH370 had taken. This detail was initially omitted from public reports. Though Malaysian authorities denied any sinister implications, international experts, including former Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott, have stated that from early on, Zahari was suspected of deliberately ending the lives of the passengers as well as his own. Still, Malaysia's 2018 final report remained inconclusive, citing no definitive evidence of crew involvement, even while acknowledging manual course deviations and shutdowns of communication systems. Despite this, many aviation experts and former investigators now support the theory that Zahari intentionally crashed the plane after incapacitating those on board. To this day, the ocean has yielded only fragments. Between 2015 and 2016, pieces of MH370 were found along the western Indian Ocean, including a flaperon confirmed to belong to the aircraft. The main wreckage and flight recorders remain lost. The tragedy of flight MH370 is a story of 239 lives abruptly stolen and hundreds of families left in eternal limbo, with the grief that endures unanswered and unresolved. On October 13, 1972, a chartered flight crashed deep in the Andes Mountains, triggering one of the most harrowing survival stories in modern history. The Fairchild FH-227D aircraft, traveling from Montevideo to Santiago, Chile, went down, leaving the survivors stranded in freezing temperatures at 3,600 meters altitude. Over the next 72 days, those who remained alive were faced with unimaginable challenges. The flight carried 45 people, including 19 members of the Old Christians Club rugby team, along with their families and supporters. From the start, the journey proved difficult. The plane was underpowered and overloaded, flying into one of the highest mountain ranges on Earth during unstable weather. After a forced overnight stop in Argentina, the plane took off late on the afternoon of October 13th. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector Lagurara, mistakenly believed they had already passed Curico, a key navigational point in Chile, and began descending prematurely. The aircraft was still miles east, deep in the Andes, when it struck a mountain ridge. The impact was catastrophic. The plane's wings and tail cone were ripped ripped off, and the fuselage slid down a glacier at over 350 kilometers per hour before crashing into snow and ice. 12 people died instantly or shortly after. Among the dead were the pilot, Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas, who was crushed by the cockpit's impact, and several others thrown from the aircraft during the crash. Fernando Parrado, only 22 years old at the time, survived but was unconscious for 4 days with a severe skull fracture. When he awoke, he faced the grim reality that his mother, sister Susana, and many close friends had died. The survivors, 33 in number initially, were trapped in the wreckage with no rescue in sight. The fuselage offered some shelter, but food was scant. Their supplies ran out within days. They endured freezing nights where they had to huddle for warmth and punch each other to keep blood circulating. Drinking water was limited to eating snow, which burned their throats and lips until they learned to melt it in bottles. The psychological toll was immense. As hope of rescue faded when search efforts were officially called off after 8 days, a fact the survivors heard on the radio, the group faced the impossible choice of how to survive. Starvation loomed. The decision to resort to cannibalism was born not from choice but from desperation. The group, many of whom were devout Catholics, made a pact to consume the bodies of those who had died, pledging their own bodies to the others should they perish. On day 17, a deadly avalanche buried the fuselage in snow, killing 8 more people overnight. The survivors were trapped beneath a thick layer of snow, and the air inside the plane grew dangerously thin. Parrado was among those who managed to clear a small hole in the cockpit window to let fresh air in, buying the group precious time. When the blizzard ended, they dug themselves out, only to face the brutal cold and starvation again. Weeks later, when they realized help wasn't coming, the survivors began preparing for an extraordinary escape. Using information from the pilot's last transmission, they planned a route westward toward Chile. On December 12th, 61 days after the crash, Parrado, Roberto Canessa, and a third companion set off on a life-threatening trek across the mountain range. At the summit of Mount Sailor, they realized the pilot's navigational error. The green valleys of Chile lay further away than they thought. They were surrounded by mountains and snow. The group split. The third man returned to the fuselage while Parrado and Canessa pressed onward, hiking nearly 54 kilometers over 7 days, sustained only by an iron will to survive. Eventually, they encountered a Chilean muleteer who understood their desperate situation and sent for help. Parrado and Canessa were taken to a nearby village where they received food and medical care, and the Chilean authorities launched a rescue mission. On December 22nd and 23, helicopters arrived to retrieve the remaining 14 survivors from the crash site, more than 2.5 months after the disaster. The survivors were celebrated worldwide as symbols of human endurance and courage, yet each carried deep scars. Parrado lost family members and many close friends. Others, like Gustavo Zerbino and Roberto Canessa, had tended to the injured and carried the weight of decisions made in desperation. The survivors formed a bond forged in unimaginable hardship. The story also raised ethical and emotional questions about survival and human limits. For Parrado, the ordeal was not a tragedy but a testament to resilience and friendship. 50 years later, he acknowledged that he owed his life to the sacrifice of others, a sacrifice that made survival possible against all odds. On the evening of January 29, 2025, a catastrophic mid-air collision occurred over the Potomac River near Washington, D.C., forever marking the city's skies with tragedy and claiming the lives of all 67 people aboard both aircraft, 64 passengers and crew on the plane, and 3 crew members in the helicopter, shattering families and communities across the country. Flight 53, 42 had departed from Wichita, Kansas, carrying 60 passengers and 4 crew members. The jet was on its final approach to Reagan National Airport, just a few hundred feet above the Potomac River and less than a mile from the runway. The Black Hawk helicopter was performing an annual evaluation involving night vision goggles, a necessary check for its crew from Fort Belvoir. Both aircraft were in communication with air traffic control, yet a critical breach of restricted airspace combined with communication failures and radar errors led to the devastating collision around 8:47 p.m. The moment of impact was caught on video by a live stream camera, showing a violent explosion over the river. The airliner, a 20-year-old aircraft, was a regional jet relatively new on the Kansas to D.C. route. The Black Hawk, typically used for senior government officials, was on a training flight with no passengers aboard other than its crew. Among the victims aboard the airliner were a large group connected to the figure skating world, 28 individuals, including rising stars and their coaches, parents, and support staff returning from the U.S. Figure Skating National Development Camp following the recent championships in Wichita. Their dreams of Olympic competition were tragically extinguished in that single moment. 6 members of the Skating Club of Boston were lost, including gifted 16-year-old Spencer Lane and Jinna Han, their mothers Christine Lane and Jin Han, and the celebrated Russian coaching pair Evgenia Shishkova and Vadim Nomov, both former world champions who had dedicated their lives to training young skaters in the U.S. The crew of Flight 5342 was remembered for their dedication and promise. Captain Jonathan Campos, 34, had pursued aviation since childhood, accumulating nearly 4,000 flight hours, and was known for his passion and professionalism. His first officer, Sam Lilly, 28, recently engaged and full of promise, had been with the airline for 2 years. Flight attendants Ian Epstein, based in North Carolina and remembered as a radiant presence, and Denasia Elder, a devoted wife and mother of 2, also perished. Denasia's family spoke of their shock and heartbreak, describing her as a caring and vibrant woman who had moved from Coney Island to North Carolina after losing her mother. Other passengers included individuals such as Grace Maxwell, a college engineering student passionate about prosthetics, who was returning from her grandfather's funeral, and lawyers Sarah Lee Best and Elizabeth Keyes, whose legal careers focused on justice and reform. Their loss was felt deeply by colleagues and loved ones, who mourned the sudden end to lives so full of promise and impact. Kaya Duggins, a Howard University law professor and civil rights attorney, was also among those killed, leaving behind a legacy of advocacy and courage. The Black Hawk helicopter crew lost Captain Rebecca Lobach, 28, the pilot flying who was undergoing her annual night evaluation, Chief Warrant Officer 2 Andrew Eves, 39, serving as the evaluator and pilot monitoring, and Staff Sergeant Ryan O'Hara, 29, the crew chief and a new father, whose death left his young family grieving. In the days following the collision, the National Transportation Safety Board released a preliminary report highlighting a dangerously narrow vertical separation between the helicopter route and the airplane's final approach path. The report criticized the Federal Aviation Administration for not acting on a decade's worth of near-miss alerts in the same airspace. Investigations revealed that only one air traffic controller was managing the helicopters and certain flights from Reagan National's tower at the time, with understaffing a contributing factor to the tragedy. The search and recovery efforts concluded on February 4th, with all major pieces of both aircraft and the remains of the 67 victims recovered. Grieving families, friends, and communities across the nation struggled to comprehend the scale of loss. Tributes poured in for all those whose futures were cut short. This disaster left a deep scar on the nation, one that will never heal. On January 31, 2000, Alaska Airlines Flight 261 was on a routine trip from Puerto Vallarta to Seattle via San Francisco. But what began as a normal flight soon turned into a nightmare, as a seemingly minor mechanical issue evolved into a terrifying descent. The aircraft, a McDonnell Douglas MD-83, departed Puerto Vallarta at 1:37 p.m. with 83 passengers and 5 crew members. The pilots, Captain Ted Thompson and First Officer Bill Tansky, were highly experienced. Early in the flight, the horizontal stabilizer, a key component controlling pitch, stopped responding properly. The autopilot was disengaged as the crew manually flew the aircraft while trying to troubleshoot the fault. Despite no official emergency declared, Captain Thompson eventually requested diversion to Los Angeles. Shortly after, while flying at 26,000 feet, the plane abruptly pitched nose down. The jack screw assembly controlling the stabilizer had failed due to excessive wear from poor lubrication, an entirely preventable issue. The crew fought to regain control, eventually pulling the aircraft out of the dive. Still airborne, they requested space over the ocean to test landing configurations. But a second failure sent the MD-83 into an unrecoverable dive. The plane rolled inverted, and moments later, both engines failed. At 4:21 p.m., Flight 261 struck the Pacific Ocean nose first at over 300 miles per hour. The aftermath was devastating. Bodies and wreckage were scattered across the sea. The Navy and Coast Guard deployed sonar equipment, ships, and submersibles in deep waters near Anacapa Island to recover remains in the black boxes. What they pieced together revealed not just a tragic crash, but one rooted in missed maintenance and oversight. The toll was immense. Among the victims were entire families. The Clemensons of Seattle, David and Carolyn, with their children Coriander, Blake, Miles, and 6-month-old Spencer, were all lost. They were returning from a family vacation, just like their close friends, the Pearsons, who perished with their daughters Rachel and Grace. The crash left 2 neighborhoods in mourning and friends unable to comprehend the void left behind. Also on board were Terry and Barbara Ryan of Redmond, their sons James and Bradford Pat, and friends gathered to celebrate Jim's 30th birthday and Pat's college graduation. Jim, a flight attendant, was working that flight. Their family friend recalled them as a deeply bonded group who always supported one another. Craig and Paul Polanco, Alaska Airlines employees, known for their humor and elaborate holiday displays, died together, as did wine writer Tom Stockley and his wife Peggy, who left a simple love note for her 93-year-old mother before the trip. That note was found days after the crash, one last echo of a life lost too soon. These weren't just names on a passenger list. They were doctors, parents, children, students, friends, and partners, each remembered for the warmth they brought to others. What united them on Flight 261 was not just their tragic end, but the ordinary joy of travel, of returning home. The loss resonated deeply because it was preventable. A single mechanical oversight set off a chain of events that took 88 lives and left families shattered. In the end, it wasn't just a crash. It was a catastrophe rooted in missed warnings, carried out in 9 minutes of terror, and mourned in every life left behind.